pardon me just 1 second, lecture. Can I just mention that in the wee hours of the morning, I cut and pasted, pardon me, Jacob.
No, you're fine.
You're psyching yourself up and I'm kind of, I'm sorry. In the wee hours of the morning, I cut and pasted the readings for next Sunday. And I read them through, and unlike most times when I read through the readings for the first time, there was nothing that sparked for me. So maybe you'll give me the spark.
Oh, Jake. The spark plug.
Gotta go to the Greek. No.
All right, Cruiser.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom.
You can start over.
Don't edit that
What happens? You lose your place?
Continue on.
Let the man speak.
That's never happened before. A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The word of the Lord.
Thank you.
And before I start, the first reading is from Exodus, which is the Ten Commandments, and the Gospel is John's articulation of the cleansing of the temple. So, morons. I have morons on my team. We're not going to get robbed going down the mountain. We have no money going down the mountain. Okay, obviously none of you guys have seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So why do I start my homily with morons? Well, not just because I want to work that word into a homily, but the foolishness of God that St. Paul is talking about, the Greek word actually is moron. It comes from moros, which means fool, dull, unintelligent, which is where we also get the word for in psychology of moron. But St. Paul is speaking about this foolishness of God that has become the stumbling block for the Jews and is also foolishness, absurdity to the Gentiles, especially the Greeks. So, St. Paul is not saying that God is dumb. He's not saying that God is unintelligent. What he is articulating in a simple way is that God's ways are not our ways. So we have, three main characters in this second reading from Corinthians. We have the Jews on the one side, who we've heard in the first reading of the heart of their law with the Ten Commandments. On the other side of the question, we have the Greeks. Remember, Paul is writing along the Sea of Corinth in Ephesus, and he's writing to primarily Greek-speaking Gentiles and Jews. So what's the stumbling block for these Greeks? Well, let's think about it. What are the Greeks known for, especially in first century Palestine? Aristotle and Plato are ruling the day of all the intellectual elites, and the Greeks, honestly, are masters of truth. They're philosophers. Now, the Jews, on the other hand, see Christ as really a contradiction in a very true sense to their law. And why? Because the Jews, it's not that the Jews are unopen to this possibility of who Christ is as the Messiah, but maybe there's some hesitancy to follow him because Christ claims to be who? The Son of God. How does God have a son in Jewish theology? That's really hard to reconcile. Also, Christ has this unique way of not recognizing, in some instances, the Sabbath. And if the Ten Commandments is the heart and the Torah of the Jewish law, how can Christ claim to be the Son of God and yet still disobey the commandments? So you have the one side of the Jews who are very true to the law and even open to a Messiah. But then on the other side, the Greeks, firm believers of truth. And as someone who is extremely rational, what do you do with things that we hear in the New Testament like a virginal birth or the resurrection? Really hard, nonsensical things to a Greek. So that's the stage or the real, I think, benefit that St. Paul enlightens for us as people who just think of, we accept this as most of us cradle Catholics, and these things aren't even questioned. But for a Jew and Greek coming from completely different backgrounds and understandings, this is really tough. So in order for St. Paul's reading to have real effect for us, we have to look at St. John's presentation of the cleansing of the temple. Before I talk about this, keep in mind St. John gives us a different perception out of any of the other Gospels. Because where is this reading coming from? This is the second chapter of John's Gospel. All the other synoptics give the cleansing at the temple when? Right at the beginning of the Holy Week. So Christ actually is not in his passion now. This is right after the wedding at Cana. He's just beginning. Now, St. Augustine would propose the fact that there are actually two cleansings, which some guys are like, oh, that doesn't really make any sense. St. John isn't writing chronologically, he's writing spiritually. We're not going to solve that problem today. But when we come back to the cleansing of the temple later in Lent, think about the importance of what if this is actually Christ's second time to cleanse the temple. Okay, so back to John. The 2-3 main sentences that I want to read to you that shout Old Testament prophecy take place when Christ has entered the temple and he says, take these out of here. He's talking to the money changers and the people selling the animals for the sacrifices. He says, take these out of here and stop making my Father's house into a marketplace. St. John then says, the disciples recalled these words of Scripture. Zeal for your Father's house consume me. And at this, the Jews asked for a sign. And then what does Christ say? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews didn't bat an eye when Christ said, take this out of my Father's house. And that actually should have raised more of a question for them than when he talks about the destruction of the temple. Because to claim to be the Son of God is to claim a divine essence that the Jews really should have been uncomfortable with. But what does this mean if Christ will raise this temple? In a very real way, all the fathers of the church talk about this, especially Origen and Chrysostom, about Christ is proclaiming in a bold way the fact that he is the new temple. And if Christ is the new temple, what St. John later talks about as not a temple to be worshipped in a particular place or on this mountaintop, but to be worshipped at this temple in spirit and truth, then that means that Judaism, as the Jews of that time know it, is going to radically change. Which is a stinging statement. Now, with that in mind, so Christ is really shaking up the temple worship of that time. And keep in mind that the ones selling these things in the temple actually have permission to do this from the temple authorities. And so that's even more striking that Christ would say, get out of here. Now, the zealots of the time of the first century like to use this as justification that Christ is who? He's a social revolutionary, right? He's clearing the place because we're not abiding by the law. And who do they point to? They point to who? Phineas in the book of Numbers. Who, you guys remember the story of Phineas where he impales the priest caught in idolatry? That's the zeal that the zealots want to adhere to what Christ is doing. But Christ is actually going much further than that. Because in those two statements, we hear the universality principle of what the temple is from the prophet of Isaiah in chapter 56, about how the temple is a place of worship and prayer for all nations. So, where is Christ? He's in the court of the Gentiles. Not a place that's supposed to be meant for selling and buying goods for the sacrifice, but a place of prayer. The Gentiles are getting gypped because they can't pray. And Christ is concerned for that and has a zealous zeal, a zeal for clearing this place, right? And then in Jeremiah, what is Jeremiah talking about when he says, the zeal for my father's house consumes me? The Jews are on the edge of the exile. And Jeremiah is acknowledging the fact that the Jews need to be purified. Now, how does Christ, again, purify the temple? He doesn't just walk in and say, hey guys, you think you're doing things wrong, you wanna leave. No! He throws the tables over, he pours out the money. In order for the men to acknowledge the fact that they are defiling the temple, he must bring their intentions for them out into public. It's just like when you have an infected wound. You can't just put a Band-Aid on top of it. No. The wound needs to be lanced open, and the infection needs to be squeezed and drawn out in order for honest and true healing to take place. That is what Christ is doing in the temple. Okay, so we've talked a lot about this temple, how Christ is a stumbling block for the Jews and the Greeks, but how does that honestly play a part in our lives? You're baptized, right? At your baptism, you become temples of the Holy Spirit. Every time you receive communion, you hold Christ inside of you. So how do you hold yourselves as temples of God? The question I found myself asking as I was going through this is, what am I keeping from God? What do I not want Him to purify me of? Now, honestly, I can give you a whole list, and I don't want to make a public confession here. But we realize the need for God's forgiveness and mercy most when we're on our knees in the confessional. It's in that place when we ask Christ to honestly enter into our lives and to purify ourselves that we can see with the light of Christ what needs to be purified. So we are now in the 3rd week of Lent. If you're like me, I have completely, well, maybe one of my Lenten observances I've completely blown off, right? I've been doing a terrible job. I need to be bolstered in my faith. And so an honest purpose of this homily is to recommend to you, if you're in that place, that Lent, in a real sense, is not even close to being over. Christ wants to purify you of whatever it is you struggle most with. So I urge you to strengthen your Lenten observances. And why is penance, why is mortification important? Well, St. Luke talks about it, or describes it like this. For he who does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Christian mortification is indispensable to following the Master. Without suffering and pain and death, the cross becomes a meaningless symbol. St. Jose Maria Escriva says it like this. We must find ourselves juxta crucem, besides the cross. And if we don't deny ourselves, then we will never be a soul for prayer. St. Teresa Avila has this articulation. To suppose that he, Christ, would admit to be his close friends, pleasure-loving people who want to be free from all trials is ridiculous. Brothers and sisters, we have to be willing to accept that cross that Christ is offering to us. And today, especially today, as Lent is still in a real sense getting rolling for us, I beg for this grace for each and every one of us to let this enter into our lives. When you receive the Holy Eucharist today, you are strengthened, you will be strengthened, and you will be reaffirmed to the fact that you're not in this alone. Christ walks with us. Rest on Him and allow Him to cleanse His temple, which is not just some ancient temple in 1st century Palestine, but it's our very selves. Our penances then become stumbling blocks and foolishness for those around us. It may seem absurd, especially to the man of the world. And maybe we even have that experience ourselves of trying to rid ourselves of vices. It seems so contrary to our natural fallen concupiscence. So for all of us, in this third Sunday of Lent, I encourage you to renew your Lenten practices and to allow Christ to walk beside you. Take courage, animo, right? Mut, haben Mut, bolster yourselves. If you do this, we all run the risk of becoming like St. Paul, a fool for Christ. And this is a fool, a moron, that we should all long to be.
So what is that animo